Hello, everyone. Welcome back and blessings. We are on the 20th episode of our journey through the zodiacal faces and the second decan of Libra. Welcome back, everyone. Again, happy birthday, Libra. I'm Elsa. I'm joined again, thankfully and gratefully, by KD Dayton and David Fisher. Welcome back, y'all. Austin Coppock calls this two links of a chain. And T. Susan Chang calls this the ties that bind. And then we have the tarot card, the Three of Swords, which is the Lord of Sorrow. And we will get into this dichotomy, this decan, and the cards a little bit later. Date.
This decan falls between October 2nd or 3rd until October 11th or 12th.
Awesome. Thank you, KB. So I'll start us off just reading some, I kind of picked some quotes and little bits from what Decan or what Austin says about this decan. And a lot of these are going to be direct quotes because I don't think, sometimes I'll just take notes and kind of get a feel for it. But the way that Austin puts some of this, I felt like keeping it in his words. This decan is ruled by Saturn, unequivocally in both systems. And I think we'll get, so we've got, in that case, then we've got the World card as Saturn card. And in the Hermetic system, it's called the Universe. We've got that here. And the universe is called the Great One of the Night of Time. So very Saturnine. All right, so let's get into it. So in the second decan, we encounter a priest presiding over a marriage, a binding together. The work of Mott continues. It shifts the focus now into lasting union. The promises and contracts that link people together are created and tested here. Weak links are exposed, but also the true heart is revealed. It begins with a promise. What is promised completely depends on the actions of those involved. So I thought that that was really interesting with Libra and Saturn, how, it's a very action-oriented kind of contractual thing. He goes on to say, images of both heartbreak and the good life abound for this decan, which we will get into because he starts to talk about here where, unlike in other decans, the kind of older texts are a little more cheerful even, and we'll get to that with the Picatrix that David will read later, but it's marriage, joy, a journey of marriage, things like this.
And there are even some modern tarot decks and more modern cards that have a slight bent towards the cheerful, which is not what you'd expect.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into this because there's a big dichotomy, and I think that's why I wanted to read directly from Austin, because his words really kind of bring us on a journey, kind of like revealing what that is. And then we can talk about it a little bit more. But I think if you have Saturn, that's kind of, Saturn has that dichotomy built within. So it's like, it's long-term and long-lasting, but it's also, for better or worse in that case, So he goes on to say, it's the archetype of all lasting unions, binding things together. So marriage, especially in traditional societies, involved binding two people's fates. The partner's fortune was like your own. Not but death could make it otherwise. So you've got Saturn there. Till death do us part is the vows we're taking in general when we're coming together for marriage. And he'll go on to say how those things can translate a little bit into just contracts with others and friends, contracts in general. In this phase, thus, we have lasting unions and blended karma. The choice of whom to chain oneself to and under what terms is therefore critical. Both sacred covenants and profane deals occur here. The contract, then, is both a weapon and an armor in this decan, for it both protects and compels. The contract has been associated with Saturn since the Babylonian phase of astrology, and Saturn's rulership in this phase excels at binding things together. Yet Saturn is also infamous for distributing suffering. Indeed, the breaking of happy marriages and fruitful alliances is as much a subject of this phase as their joyful continuation. And he goes on to talk about the pain of betrayal. And I think that's when we will start to get into our Three of Swords, our minor arcana. Here is the sorrow of an alliance betrayed or a wife abandoned. Among the Greeks, the diamond Horokos presided over the protected oaths. So he was actually the brother of the Aranis, or the Furies that we talked about before, the three who kind of talk about, what were they?
Punishment.
Yeah, punishment, or like bringing in like the sorry.
consequences.
Yeah, there was words that I was going to say, but I don't need to say any of this stuff. So he's actually the brother of the Furies, or the Aranis, and he punished those who broke their oaths. So he was actually the punisher, and I think maybe the Furies or the Aranis, or they were maybe ones who pulled you out or called you out, but it was this daimon who punished those who broke their oaths, which I think is really interesting, because if you maybe did some, it just reminded me of magical ritual, right? So if you were going to engage in that kind of like contractual thing, you maybe would be good to give some props and some flowers to this daimon.
Well, I also, this seems like a good place to bring up, if it's okay, that we're looking at Venus and Saturn here. Venus as the ruler of Libra, Saturn as the other lord of this Decan. And Venus is the only planet, the only archetype that sort of gets on with Saturn, right? It's the only one. And Venus exalts Saturn in the sign of Libra. And the thing that they have in common is that attraction to promises, that attraction to oaths, like you say. And so
absolutely,
yeah, I feel like that's a really poignant piece of what Austin's referencing as well in his book.
Yeah, and the daimon that punishes those who break their oaths is very Saturnine as well as Venus, because she's
like
justice.
The bad side of being, yeah, exactly.
She's
the side
justice,
of Venus,
yeah. So it's like,
vengeful.
don't make me a promise that you're not going to keep, or the reaper will come, or those punishments will be heavy-handed, essentially. So yeah, that's a really good point. And if you think of Venus, like, she wants to be in love. She's the goddess of marriage. And what is marriage if it's not these sort of like, I mean, it's romantic and it's the lover and it's Mars and Venus, but when you put Venus with Saturn, it is that contractual bound, like, you promise to love me for the rest of your life. So let's keep those vows.
Commitment. It's a real commitment. And Venus isn't like debilitated in Saturn signs either. In fact, it has some dignity by the traditional scheme in Aquarius. So,
Yeah,
they're not totally incompatible.
No, I don't think they are. And remember, we talked about things like, like, especially in the masculine air sign of Venus, we have things I think of like refined art and ballet and things that take a lifetime to work, and they take a lot of work in order to produce this, refinement. So that's the same with relationships and any kind of contractual binding. This space also includes those situations where one has been bound to an obligation which they cannot happily fulfill. Therefore, we're faced with a choice where do you honor your word and suffer, or do you break your oath and gain freedom? So I think that's a really, poignant one that I think a lot of people probably deal with when it comes to contracts. Like, once you give your word, and then he goes on to say, wisdom can prevent one from falling into such a bind, but it offers no salvation for one who's caught. So it's like, the foresight again, and being able to decide what we're binding ourselves to. And once we have, again, that kind of like heartbreak or betrayal, or being like, oh, I gave my word, but this isn't for me anymore, whatever it is, and trying to deal with that. I mean, most people can probably understand what that feels like if they've been in relationships that haven't lasted, or contracts that they said, work contracts, like, oh yeah, I said I'd do this, but now it's not going to work for me. And that's a really hard thing. Do we abandon ourselves in order to keep our word, or do we break our word and abandon the other in order to be loyal to ourselves? So that is a hard bind. The power of the contract creates more than misery, though. It is only in earnest commitment which allows relationships to endure in both lean harvests and fat returns. The power of obligations fixes volatile passions And when properly engaged, it lays a firm foundation for the good life. So yeah, I mean, that to me, that just speaks again. It's like Saturn can be this enduring, if you think of Saturn, it's agriculture, right? And it's long-term enduring, it's families, it's ancestors. And those are the types of things that really allow us to build, right? Build on the backs of our ancestors, build in family units, build our stocks of grain in order to pass on to the next generation. So sometimes we don't feel like getting up and plowing the field, or you know what I'm saying? Sometimes we don't feel like those sort of heavy contractual obligations, but to do so can lay a really amazing firm foundation for what we're trying to build. So,
and especially socially, I feel like those commitments, especially when we talk about some of those Saturn keywords like agriculture, to some degree ancestors and things like this, the reason why we still prioritize, though, even though it's hard work to sustain them, is because it's connection. We feel connected to other people via those things. Agriculture, for instance, we just had the autumn equinox a couple weeks ago. This is the time of the harvest, and that is what brought people together in communities, throughout history, the time of reaping what has been sown, as well as, ancestry and the past and history, and remembering these difficult times of striving can often be rallying points around community and connection, which are Venus keywords. So
absolutely. And it's kind of where the rubber hits the road in a lot of ways with contracts as well, isn't it? Which is like, we've reaped everything that we've sown, whether it's fat or lean. And, who's going to stick with us if the crops are lean or whatever? And how are we going to sort of divide that and stay connected? How are we going to share that? Again, in community, how are we going to stay connected for the least of these? Or how are we going to be generous for the, most wealthy of these? And just sort of like sitting with that, like all the work has been done and it's the darkening of the light, and now we're stuck with, like Saturn, sometimes it makes you feel bound or stuck, and you're kind of stuck with your harvest now, and everybody in your sphere, your family and your village, or your contractual business partners, we've seen now what we brought in and what the fruits of that labor have been. And sometimes that can be intense, for better or worse, right? Just to kind of sit with that moment. I think it's pretty self-explanatory here, whether it's engaging in business partnerships or really in most things. This is the marriage Decan, contractual Decan. And if we think something's going to last for life, or if we think a business endeavor is going to be lucrative and it's not, we feel betrayed. Our heart is broken. We have to start anew. We feel like there's been a death to what we hoped for, or a death of that connection. And Venus is also like hope and justice and connection, right? So yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory at the same time.
It's a challenge, really. I mean, because you see this card, this minor arcana card of the Decan, the Lord of Sorrow, and to have that intimately tied to binding and marriage is like, oh, really?
Yeah, but if you think about it, it's so true. So many
Exactly.
people start out their marriages like, oh my God, we're in love. And like most people suffer their progeny. I mean, most people suffer their marriage. It doesn't need to be that way. It can be romantic and beautiful and like feel good to have someone there with you for the long haul, no matter what happens, right? That can feel very secure, but it can also, for a lot of people, it feels like an entrapment. A lot of people are stuck in unhealthy or unhappy marriages, and they don't know how to get out, or if they should stay in, or, you know, when does something count as a betrayal, or, you know, do I betray the other or do I betray myself?
No.
This is where we are made conscious of the consequences of choosing one thing over another. There's always a shadow side. When you're too divided between your heart and what you know is right, your heart and your mind, basically, which is the main contract that humans have to here is the feather and the heart being weighed against each other in the balances in the hands of justice. And that symbolism of the Hermetic deck. And you have the mind and the heart being that contract that we have to always nurture in our lives. How do we do that? We have to be always made aware of each of them, of their perspectives from time to time. Here, we see the mind overruling the body in a sense, or the instincts, or the more instinctual side of the person. You get the law over grace in a way, where you have to, in order to assert your ideal or assert yourself, in order to be able to set clear boundaries and to enact a certain principle that you have, you must kill a little bit of your spirit. And that's paradoxical. This is why this card feels so bad. It feels like Saturn, but it's Saturn exalted, so it gives you good results. I hope this gives you also a dimension of how malefic planet exalted is not necessarily good in experience, but it will produce enlightenment that will allow you to grow through circumstance. The Three of Swords is a transition of the mind that is kind of accepting that it isn't in grief for its limiting process. It's like, I have to limit this in order to be able to balance it, in order to be able to achieve some form of harmony within it. Limit, the World card, Saturn, the harmony part is Libra, and that kills the spirit somewhat. Because it's not allowed to do the multiplicity of things that it would like to do. But in that, it builds resilience, it builds faith, it builds, which are things of Saturn and Venus, it builds
character. I mean, if you think of
character.
like moral fortitude or something, that's not
moral
just Saturn.
fortitude.
Yeah, it's very Venusian in that sense,
And so, but the threes, they are very transitional. Remember when the Three of Wands, which is opposite to this particular Decan, we can do as we please because we have the higher perspective. Here, it's like, yeah, we still have that, we might still have a higher perspective, but we know that it's not according to what we expected. It is something else. And the focus is on that something else. It's not that with the Three of Swords, you cannot have a good experience. It's just that the good of it is more of in a mind field, because you are aware of how that will ideally benefit you in the future if you stick to this particular modus operandi, that is. But rather than the Three of Wands, that is just like the attitude. If I keep my own impetus, if I keep my own certainties and embodying my truth, I will achieve something. And this is just a transitory period. I can just trust, have faith. Here, it's not have faith in your own will or in your own willpower. It's having faith in your ideal. It's having faith in that which was established as a higher concept than what you want and what you're allowed to do by your physical mind.
Yeah, I want to comment on that because, this is opposite Aries. And last time we talked a little bit about like Venus in Taurus is like you were saying, David, it's like it's bodily and it's, warm, but here you have the mind aspect. So it's like your mind is telling you like, I will get up and do this thing, or I've made my commitment. So now I will, do this for the other, not because, it's like you were saying with the Wands or Aries, it's like, it's me, it's my, lease on life, it's my go time or whatever. But here it's like reining that in for the sake of, something more long term, or reining in your own bodily senses, like you were saying, between the heart, which is that like broken heart or that betrayal of the three, but just moving into the mind and saying, like this will be good for the long term, so therefore I will do it. And we have to remember it's the darkening of the light again, so it's like when you have if you think about too, the courts, like what happens in the courts, they're just like, you know, constantly dealing with betrayals and trying to figure that out, you know? And if you
Even
think
if it's
about,
not a betrayal, even if it's not just in the context of betrayal, think about agreeing to disagree when you break up with a person because you're like, yeah, we are too incompatible, and the pain that that brings your body because your body has grown accustomed to having a sort of comfort coming from that direction, perhaps. When you accept that those things are not compatible and the ideal has to overcome the necessity of the body for that particular routine that you establish with that person, you feel the three of swords. You feel this pain of letting go.
And, you know, I know that there's a heart on this, so we do often think of romantic relationships, but I think even more broadly, you only seek justice and you only go to the courts when you've been wronged or you have wronged somebody else, right?
yeah, yeah. And when I think of like achieving that ultimate balance, and then the world card is like the end, right? It's like what happens when you're reckoning with some to balance something out, and you've got like the end of a situation, or you're preparing for the long haul. It's like, let's take it away from heartbreak and love and marriage for a second and just think of your job. Let's say you work, so Saturn is like working in, you know, like labor fields and things like that. If you have a job that's not career oriented, or even if you do, just getting up early for your job every day, it's like you have, it's mind over matter, something like this, or like going to the gym, or doing your sport, or doing your craft. It's like there's so much sacrifice that needs to be done for those things. Like every day I have to get up and work, even if I don't want to, even if I'm tired, even if my body's saying no, 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 rest or whatever, you know. Or let's say, you know, I'm married to a spouse that I know that I love, but I have some kind of, you know, temptation, or I have, you know, some kind of feeling of wanting to get out, or I have another person. Because a lot of times, you know, in tarot, they'll read this as like a cheating situation or a third party situation. But if you think of being faced with something like that after 10 or 20 years of a marriage, it's like a mental choice of staying faithful to the word, getting up and going to work because I told my boss, or staying in the marriage and not doing what I want to because I know that the marriage is valuable, or whatever it is. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, I might want to do this thing, but my marriage is more important. Or I might want to stay in bed, but I gotta go to my job. So whether it's like self-betrayal, in that way, you're kind of betraying yourself, right? You're betraying your body, you're betraying your mind. Everything in you says like, I can't do this or something like this, but you get up and you do the thing anyway. And that's that darkening of the light feeling that we have here. Is it's not sunny anymore. It's arduous in some type of a way. At some point it's going to be tested in an arduous way. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, so I think this would be a good time to start talking about 36 Secrets and TC's and Chang's chapter on this Decan, which again, what was the title of it again?
The Ties That Bind, I believe.
Ties That Bind for this middle decan of Libra. So as with all other Libra signs, we have the Justice card being the major arcana representing that sign. And we've seen the Libra card in our last Decan video, but what I wanted to call to mind for this one specifically is the element of justice and how it's going to influence the world. Chang references in her deck that justice is capable of shaping things. It's capable of governing things, which is, you know, it's logical when you think about it, how we consider justice as in some ways governing values and morals, but also society and community. And that's the role oftentimes of justice, again, when there's conflict or when there is loss of some sort on behalf of one party or the other. So the cards that I have up here on screen reference that to some extent. We have, of course, on the far left, the Rider-Waite-Smith representation of justice. In the middle, we have a card that had some interesting symbolism in it. I really liked the owl symbolism here for the element of wisdom that comes, and I think it calls to exactly what you just said, Elsa, about the wisdom of making a decision to value the commitment.
And I didn't say that, Austin said that, but yes. And the other thing about the owl that I think is really interesting is, I know crows are Saturnine, but the owl is very Saturnine because not only does it represent wisdom, but in many cultures, it's an omen of death.
Yes.
So I think that's a really beautiful kind of like Saturn token that they put right in front, as well as that like skullish urn that she's holding.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you think about it, that's the great moment of justice. Like if you know, depending on what you believe of the afterlife, when you die, and the message that death brings is reaping what you've sown throughout your time on earth. But the owl can also be a little bit indicative of a visionary element, which I think is very important to this middle decan, where you're not necessarily not at all, not necessarily, you're not operating on impulse. You are not operating on impulse or instinct. You are operating on a feeling of loss. You need to use your mind. This is the Suit of Swords, of course. You need to use your intellect to process and understand what's happening. It is not a moment to necessarily gut feeling your way through.
It's a mind over matter thing, right? When Venus is like tempting you towards like whatever Venusian qualities, and I forget what you just said, like the word that you used, but I was like, God, something about shaping, justice, shaping and molding.
Shaping or governing. Yeah, governing.
Yeah, that's super, super Venusian to, you know, if you think of like the feminine archetype of the knight as like a creative force, you do think of like shaping things into a type of reality, right? And again, when you take that into the mental sphere and add that, you know, Saturnine quality, it is that, you know, that mind over matter.
100%. 100%. And it's actually a really revealing aspect of the Justice card that is, I think, important to keep in mind. I do actually find this card somewhat difficult to interpret in readings in a non-literal way. And so studying this decan a little more closely has revealed a lot to me. And on the far right, I just love this deck. There's the cat biting the owner's hand as a representation of justice, because you know, it can come back to bite you depending on what you've done. So,
and don't bite the hand that feeds you.
And don't bite the hand that feeds you. There you go. It's also a pretty good representation there. All right, and then we have the World. So the World is the major arcana card for Saturn, which is the secondary ruler of this decan. And there are a couple quotes that I want to read as we look at these up on screen from 36 Secrets. Chang says that there are times when we cannot or will not follow the script, when choreography confines us, when Saturn's chains feel like marionette strings. Now, this is absolutely calling to Austin's chapter.
Oh, so good.
Right?
Oh my goodness.
It's beautiful, because what you see here are female figures who look like they might be dancing in some way, but there is still that element of confinement, of the rules in which you must dance. And our teacher, Achuta Bava, introduced this to me, but I believe it might have been Austin who elaborated on this. Again, I don't know the source of this text, but thinking of Saturn as the metronome that sets the time of the dance. You know, as we are going through life, the great dance, there is a certain pattern, a certain rhythm that we all follow. When Saturn changes signs or has a significant transit of some sort, it's like that cadence all of a sudden shifts and changes. That choreography that she references in this quote is the patterns of Saturn dictating the dance of our lives. Right?
Yeah, I think there couldn't be, in my mind, there couldn't be a more illustrative example than that of a professional dancer for Venus or for Saturn exalted in Venus' sign, or for Venus in this decan, or really any of the Libra decans in a sense, because it's just, if you any type of classical dance, right? It doesn't have to be ballet, it could be Odissi, it could be any kind of classical dance. You watch this form float effortlessly along the stage, and it brings this sense of beauty and effortlessness, but the structure and the timing and the footwork and the absolute precision that you have to execute inside of your mind first and then translate it out into the body. It's not Venus and Taurus that's just luxing out at all.
No.
It is so articulate, and through so much pain that we get that sort of sense of freedom. And in yoga, you know, I used to say this to my students all the time, and I think I've referenced this in another video, but in order to find true liberation in a yogic posture, it takes so much dedication and work. Like, you can't even get into it at first, and your body's all like wobbly, and like it takes so many times of repeating that practice and that posture for you to even really, for it to open up at all and be able to take a breath in it and be like, oh, this is it, you know? So the liberation that comes through discipline as well, you know, that is a really key like element to this as well. Like, after putting in so much work, the liberation that comes through being able to execute a choreographed dance with precision is just a beautiful feeling.
And what I want to add to this is that Saturn is the outermost planet of the visible ones. I know Uranus is occasionally visible. Don't bother me with that. But Saturn is the outermost classical planet that is, you know, from the visible ones. It's the slowest. And it speaks to, I was listening to Schmidt talking about the personality within one of his talks, translating modern astrology into the translating Hellenistic astrology into the modern
Idiom.
mind, I think.
Modern idiom, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, he's speaking about how what distinguishes us as, you know, human form of life is that we are concerned about our death, about our finitude. And this is what drives every impulse in our lives. The dance to which we are limited, the choreography that we are all performing, is one of, we know we are going to die, and we try to embody as much multiplicity as is allowed without losing a kind of specific focus within those limits. So it's in the end, it comes up. You're notable if you have been able to single yourself out from the crowd, in the sense that you have performed one particular dance. You have been that steady. You have been that precise at being yourself. Like Queen Elizabeth, for example, she has a Saturn-ruled ascendant. She has a Saturn exactly on her midheaven. She dies at a Saturn transit that is, you know, incredibly important, and all of that. And she has a life that is very defined by her role, you know, very, very defined, to the point where you do not see Queen Elizabeth outside of her role. Whereas Charles, well, you have, so you see that there are people who actually embody what their confines are, you know, they can conform to it in a way that shows stability, strength, power, all of those things that Saturn in a good position or in good enough a position would provide, as it did for Queen Elizabeth. But, you know, if you always have to give up something, you know, you can say that she abdicated a lot of her humanity to be able to fit that role, because it had such a defined, narrow path.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is admirable. Yeah, it is difficult. Yeah, it builds stability for an ideal. But
at what cost sometimes, you know,
at what cost?
At what cost sometimes? And we talked about this in Virgo 3. You can go check that out a little bit more. But it's like at the end of life, when you're at the end, you're at the world card, you're at Saturn, you're at the Reaper, you're going to die, right? Like David just said. You know, KD has brought up some of the statistics or whatever about like when you're on your deathbed, what makes you happy? Do you wish you would have worked more? You wish you would have spent more quality time?
What defines you?
Yeah, and but also here is like, oh, I didn't give a lot to my passions. I didn't work hard. I sort of just sloppily like went along the dance, and then it's done, right? So it's like, I guess that betrayal, do I betray the other or do I betray myself, and at what cost, really comes to light, because it's like, if you dedicate yourself to learning a certain dance your whole life, that can be really rewarding. Or it can be like, man, I just danced my whole life and like I wasn't like just chilling free or like Torian or
I
like,
didn't
you know what I
look
mean?
outside of my dance
Well,
to see what else was out there. Like,
being disciplined means that you are killing a little bit of the multiplicity that gives pleasure. I'm talking about the night sect, Venus, Moon here. And again, bringing in that idea of the masculine sign being kind of limiting to the idea of the multiple, even though it is ruled by Venus. And now with Saturn, a diurnal planet, we are seeing the things that we have to ignore and avoid willingly from the multiplicity in order to be able to build stability and long term. But that is still reminding us of what? We are limited ourselves. We have a time limit. We cannot do everything. We cannot be everything. Otherwise, we would just live forever and wait until it was time for us to become something else and be happy always. But we
And yeah,
can't do that because we are not, you know, the unified consciousness of the universe or something.
yes, and it is, and it's again the Lord of Agriculture. Like, we can't grow all year round. It's too cold and dark. Like, I might want to do more work, but it's snowing and it's dark outside now.
And
Like,
so
I can't.
discipline makes itself necessary. It's a necessity given by the reality, the limits of this particular world that we're inserted in.
And necessity is a Saturn word. And I think that's when we come to the darkening of the light and the yin and the yang, it's like, that is like, in order to achieve that perfect balance or whatever, there are, like we've been saying, limits and sacrifice, and it gets dark and we can no longer do the work, or, you know, it gets cold and we can no longer do the crops even if we wanted to or whatever, you know? So it's like that balance, there's pain in that. There's like, you know, there's so much pain in that.
it's really poignant, because in order to really understand the world, you have to accept that both beginnings and endings will come and pass. And it's kind of that phrase that became the soap opera name, As the World Turns. Right? It's always going to turn. So you just have to kind of acknowledge that in order to, what is it? What is that phrase? I actually think that both Austin and T. Susan Chang bring it up in their book. It's like, in order for there to be, there must be suffering in order for there to be attachment, right? It's the Buddhist, you know, that's the basic principle.
Yeah, like you were saying, as the world turns in, like, you know, if you want to use, like, I guess Indian or, you know, Hindu, you could say like the Leela, the drama. If you want to talk about like the wheel of life and karma and all of those things, we're talking about samsara, the wheel that never quits turning on this life or on any life, and just reckoning with that.
Absolutely. I love that.
And Libra's about that. Like, we have to take a little bit of the light and a little bit of the dark. It's like, I know that I feel better when I get up and do Ashtanga for 3 hours every morning. Or I know that I feel better when I hit the gym however many days a week. Or I know I feel better when I, you know, do my meditation practice every day or whatever, you know. But it also feels better to lay in bed a little bit later or whatever, you know. So those are the types of choices and checks and balances that we have to make, you know.
Absolutely. It's kind of speaking to my soul right now.
It's
And honestly,
this day.
we are more able to have more of those pleasurable moments if we are able to rationalize our routines and enough in that way. You know, creating stability has to do with being able to balance a little bit of, you know, the multiplicity with the things that you have to give up on. When you get used to death being all around you through circumstance, you get used to those choices. It's like, Yeah, I'm gonna have to kill a little part of me that were those ideas that were attached to that particular thing. But I know the process. I already know the drill. I already know how to go through it. So I don't need to get overly attached to it. This is a healthy expression of the Three of Swords, really.
And it's very masculine if you think about it as well. It's like very mind over body. It's like, I don't care if you feel like sleeping. Get up. It's like that, and you feel better when you bring a little bit of suffering into your life. I think it's like, oh, this is so please,
Yes.
internet, don't judge me, but like I think Joe Rogan, and like if you think of like, it doesn't have to be Joe Rogan, but any of those kind of like self-motivating, self-help, like all of that, they're saying like your life is going to be better if you suffer and just kill that part of you that doesn't want to work or doesn't want to get up at 4 a.m. and do like some hard ass workout or whatever it is. You just kill that little thing every day. You're
It's
just
the
like,
the endurance of Saturn that forces you. Yeah, absolutely.
it's just like suffer, and then when you're done, you feel better. You've accomplished something. You've kind of gotten over those little hurdles. Like, just embrace suffering on a few levels of your life and see what kind of beauty that can bring.
Well, I want to talk about the other two cards real quick before we go on to the Three of Swords, because that's going to be a very rich discussion as well. But in the middle, we have a representation of the world. I don't remember if I showed this before or not, but it's Venus. That's straight up Venus right there in the middle card. This is the Golden Renaissance deck. And I find that super interesting. Again, we talked about how Venus is the only planetary archetype that is somewhat welcoming to Saturn and its archetypal significance. But they also share some commonalities, like the sea. The sea foam being what Aphrodite was born of, but it is a seriously Saturnian thing to be near the sea, the seafaring people, seafaring trades and occupations. So it's just a very interesting card, I feel like, to have here for this middle decan of Libra, that Venus is actually representing the Saturn card.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to bring in a text that I really like that exemplifies that we were talking about. It goes, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So it's basically saying that when you keep connected to your spiritual truth, loving your God above all else, in other words, and you keep your mind in the higher goals of your soul, and you keep yourself in a path of awareness around those particular goals, and you try to define yourself according to them, and you don't waver, you can actually get from suffering to hope, which is, kind of turning lead into gold in an alchemical process. So that's why I like to bring in this Romans text. It's Romans 5 for anyone who wants to look into it.
I love that. And we need to talk about that again when we get to Aquarius as well, because it has those star cards vibes to me too.
Yeah, the hope after exactly. That's so true.
Definitely.
It is. And it's like,
because in the Three of Swords, we're still talking more about the suffering part.
Yeah, the suffering part, not the hope part.
Yeah, the idea of betrayal. But like, even as we, come into the ritual state, right? Again, it's not like we're just feeling it out. There's things you must do. There's orders you must go in. There's things you must petition in the right order. There's times you must do the ritual at, or you know what I'm saying? Like, and it's not about just like, oh, there is a moment for just being like, oh, I'm like enamored with, the nature right now. And there's this naturalistic sort of like ritual that just comes about born from your heart. But then there's the, planetary time to get up at 3 a.m. and do steps 1 through 10 in order to get the results. And you might do that every day for, a year or something like this, right? So yeah, and it's rewarding. It's rewarding, those rituals. And I know ritual is Mercury, but I think Venus as well as the mother is just the ritual of, think about Venus, the mother, the ritual of being a mother okay, we love our children, we love being mothers and everything.
Is that not confining?
But breastfeeding every 2 hours, 3 meals a day, doing the dirty diapers, like I mean, yeah, no wonder Venus loves Saturn, because Venus has to live that as the mother every moment. It's like it's a selfless, thankless task that you are motivated by, and you just get up and you do it out of love, right? And that's, I think, a kind of pure form of extracting.
And not a peer pressure, because you might be arrested if you don't.
True. Oh man. Well, I want to move on to a couple of Three of Swords cards here, because again, I think it's very interesting. I have another slide, a deck, a couple of cards that are a little bit more positive in their associations, but I am going to start off with the negative ones, since that's always what I hear about the Three of Swords, or the Lord of Sorrows, as it's called. You know, not just in the cookbooks of tarot, but also anecdotally, this card really does come up quite often around heartbreak. And I think that that is one of the most literal depictions here we have in the Rider-Waite-Smith decks of something. Now, I also really enjoyed how you talked about, you know, like a triad earlier, like, you know, if there are 3 people involved in a, you know, romantic entanglement and somebody's going to get hurt, because as we hear multiple times in T. Susan Chang's book, Pips like to count. So 3 can sometimes be a little bit too many. But yeah, there's many decks have this heart with the swords through it as the major representation of this card, being betrayal and heartbreak. But what's really interesting that I want to mention that we haven't talked about yet, which is that this card is ultimately leading up to and really echoes the Queen of Swords, which is a figure in the tarot deck that is often associated with divorce. And in playing cards, we have the Queen of Spades, which is probably, you know, across many different types of games, many different types of playing cards, that's a very bad card to have, the Queen of Spades. It's called, like, what, the Black Maria, Calamity Jane, all these things, these nicknames. I actually hadn't heard all of them until I read the 36 Secrets chapter on this. I had to look some of those up. But it's very interesting that it has that association with the Queen of Swords as divorced. But it is the case that this woman that is the Queen of Swords doesn't necessarily need anybody. She doesn't need anyone. She's already a queen. So the divorce,
none of us really need anyone, right? Saturn
really
doesn't need anyone. Venus wants.
Right.
We want to connect. It gives us some more juice. No one needs. I mean, in a sense, like if you're thinking like back in the day, you sort of like did need your tribe, because if you were, you know, kicked out of the tribe, it almost meant certain death for the individual in a sense. And I know like there's different ways that divorces were seen, you know, in the past. It was a hard survival for a divorced woman or for a widowed woman or something like this. But we don't need the other. We desire the other.
Desire. Yes.
We desire connection. It makes it juicier and nicer. But on a mental level, we don't need it. Yeah.
And it's like the Queen of Swords comes after the Three of Swords, right? It's like after you've realized, okay, betrayal to some degree, the world is inevitable. It's part of the ebb and flow of time, the turning of the world. And so this chick's like, no, I don't need it. I'm good.
Yeah.
Done.
And isn't that a depiction of the prodigal son in the right?
Yes. Oh my gosh. And then right next to that, we have this other really interestingly religious figure of discord and disharmony in a maybe community, family, couple environment, right? Yes. Please talk about.
It's interesting too, because it's cold, like the Queen of Swords, or the, you know, like it's like, oh, I've been betrayed and I'll never be betrayed again. And it's cold, right? The idea of that.
And you have like the prodigal son being that what you guys were talking about not needing you, like I don't need you or something like that. The prodigal son had the right to part of his father's fortune and he leaves the home of the father. You see the younger brother there kind of imitating the father as well in that protective stance. The prodigal son leaving, the foreshadowing of the pig there, meaning that the prodigal son perhaps is acting on his instincts more than his rational mind, and leaving that safe threshold of the family.
Gosh, that's such an interesting representation, I feel like, of the Three of Swords in comparison to, again, the romantic betrayal that we first come up with, but there is still that betrayal. Yeah.
But we were talking about the mind and the body as an alliance here, and we have been focusing about on the mind overcoming the body, but I feel like the depiction of the Three of Swords in this prodigal son frame is more in the sense of it's calling out to me the fact that the prodigal son came back. He regretted getting out of his father's bosom or something, because he realized all of the errors of his ways. He realized that he was being impulsive. He realized that he didn't really have a clear focus. So it is another side of the Three of Swords where you're not disciplined, basically. And I like that this deck in particular focuses on that, because it's when you're not disciplined in that way, when you choose to ignore, which is also a Saturnian word, when you choose to ignore your word, when you choose to ignore some kind of structure, and you become careless for your life, which is a fall of the sun, a luminary. You become careless for your life and for your life goals. You kind of aimlessly spend all your money, and you spend all your assets. You spend everything that you are and all your substance on frivolous things and on the multiplicity of things that you are not. So it's also a shadow sign of Saturn. And this is the prodigal son. He recovers a sense of self once he comes back to his father's home and he's welcomed again. And so what I mean by that is just like, this is, I think, the other side of the Three of Swords where heart takes over mind, and it's not working well in this particular deck.
Yeah, in a bad way. Like the sun doesn't know when it tries to individuate and feel free, and like,
because it works well in the Three of Wands in the way that you're saying.
Yes, like it tries to, like, and if you think about like affairs, let's just say you think that you want it and you feel free. A lot of times you're like, oh shit, like I regret hurting that person, or I regret what I have done, or I regret leaving my dad's home, or it's like the heart almost is leading you astray. And like that's a shadow side of Venus as well, right? Of like betraying what you said that you would do in order to chase some desire that makes you feel like, oh my God, I have to follow my heart. But the sun is at fall. Your heart is not the compass here. Your Saturn is your compass. What you said, your word, the stability is your compass here, because you might have, been led astray by your heart. And therefore, like, if you think about, David, you just saying he regretted leaving his father just made me think, like, so many times we will regret these situations that we frivolously think, like, we were so compelled by, right? Saturn or Venus being, compelled by our desire.
Our ignorance compelled us.
Yes, our ignorance, and the fall of the sun is ignorance, and Saturn is ignorance, right? So it's like we got compelled, and then, like, whether or not you're the one who got betrayed, which is terrible, but the betrayer, the one who comes with so much regret, it's like, oh my God, I just did this thing, and now I have to, own up to it or face those consequences of hurting the person that I love for something that I thought I wanted, but I don't.
Gosh. And I mean, it is just so Saturnian to need to confront that disappointment, confront that heartache, or confront that folly, that Venusian folly with reality, with like, this is the consequence. Like, I need to get myself out of this now.
Yeah.
Don't be mistaken. Just like the sea foam is very, quick on fading away, Venus is also very frivolous, as you were saying, Elsa. She is very superficial, shallow in her shadow side.
Yes.
In her, it's her nature to be easygoing, in other words. And that is something that is notorious of Venus. If she's in her good side, it will mean that the person is, you know, stable enough in their spirits and all of that. But if it's in her shadow side, it just means that they're shallow and avoidant of true depth in
And it's like a
whatever they're
delusion
engaging
of connection, right? It's like, oh my God, I thought the other person was
Facade.
like my new lover and I just love them. And in this case, it's like you want to defer to the Saturn side of like, you want to defer to the fact that no, I made a commitment to my husband or I made a commitment to my wife and I'm going to keep that. 5 years down the line, you might be like, oh my God, thank God I didn't like sleep with that person that I thought was totally amazing at the time, because now I see them and it's not the case or whatever.
Not
You
so
get
good.
you
Yeah.
get like caught in this again. I know Mars and Venus in the night sect, it's kind of like it's lustful, and Saturn is deceitful, and it's
Right.
feigned appearances and desires and things like that. So we can get caught in a trap of like betraying ourselves or betraying the people that we love for some kind of delusion.
Yes. Yes. Man, but I do want to have a disclaimer here because we've talked a lot about you know, heartbreak and trusting your mind over your heart in these situations because it can also lead you astray. When you if and when you pull this card in a reading either for yourself or for others, it doesn't necessarily spell out heartbreak. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship is going to shit. The violation of trust is different than, especially in a non-romantic relationship, different than what you might think. That heart,
Yeah.
I feel like, is so distracting. That
Mhm.
heart piece is so distracting in this card. That's what I wanted to say, is that it's not always something that is like deeply emotional to you or deeply poignant, but it is something that has this lesson for you about accepting the Saturn. I love that.
Yeah.
Accepting the Saturn in the
They
situation.
break on
You
expectations.
can't turn back.
Yeah, like even
You
as a
can't
single,
unknow.
yeah, you can't unknow. Or, you know, even as a single person, if you draw like in a personal reading, if you draw the card, it's like, again, you could just look at it as like a mind. Swords are the mind over matter, mind and heart. Like you could be pulled in one direction but be feeling like you need to be concise in another direction. It doesn't necessarily mean like a third party relationship all the time, so don't freak out. But I think that's what Katie's saying, is like, don't freak out. It could
don't
be
freak
a
out.
heartbreaker, a breakup, or a third party, but it also could be like, man, I've got all these things that are weighing on my mind and my heart is so confused, or my mind is betraying my heart at every, you know, decision or something like this, or my heart has led me astray and I don't know, you know, where to take it in my mind. Another thing for this maybe remedial would just be to, you know, find some kind of discipline between the body and the mind, right? Like maybe
Like dance.
yeah or some kind of thing like a meditation, or maybe if you're lost in that state of mind and heart, try to bring them together through some kind of ritual sense, some working out or some yoga or some meditation or something like that, to sort of sort it out.
Well, if you're going to try to channel Saturn, like we were talking about with the world earlier, and it being the grand metronome, setting the choreography for the pace of life right now, seriously, dance. And that's what's depicted in this Mother Peace card on the left, is a very vibrant dance in which these women are essentially play acting violence as a means of releasing the energy, because it's needed sometimes. You know, you have to do it sometimes, you have to release that, but it is a dance. And the chains are in fact made of daisies, the daisy
That's so
chain on the
beautiful.
bottom.
That's
The
so
constriction,
beautiful.
it's Venusian, but it's still Saturn.
This
And
actually makes
Mother
me
Peace,
remember.
oh sorry, Mother Peace never disappoints.
Never disappoint.
It reminds me of karate and martial arts in general, because you have this discipline that is needed, especially when you're training. There are these choreographies that you rehearse in these martial art trainings that you enact, especially in some styles of karate schools. Like they won't allow you to actually fight with other people until you're a certain grade, like until you're a certain
Green belt or
belt.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's because you have to be able to enact that choreography so naturally that when someone attacks you, you just embody it, and you can do it in the precise way. And you have to be conscious enough to respect the other person that you're fighting with, because they are your friend mostly. You're just training. So you have to keep yourself conscious. It has to be precise because of that. So you are in total control when you are going for your friend, so you don't actually hurt them. And so that chain of daisies reminds me of the soft awareness that you have in the back of your head that you actually love the other person that you're fighting with, which makes me very nostalgic and emotional because it was something that I actually really loved.
Yeah, that's super beautiful. And what came to mind when you were saying that is a worthy opponent. And I'm harking back
Yeah.
to what Austin was saying about the wisdom of deciding who to engage in contracts with, right? It's like you want a worthy opponent. You want, when you're dancing, I have a friend who dances UDC. Hey, Amaya. And you want, I can imagine as a dancer, if you have like, let's say backup dancers, or you're dancing as a part of a group or something like this, you want the other dancers to be as skilled as you so that it doesn't take away from the performance itself or something, right? So you want a worthy opponent in this case, which whether it's a dance or whether it's a sparring situation or a contractual situation, a worthy opponent comes to mind. You know, this card where we see the next one, the revolution, again, the science deck never disappoints, because it's a burning of like a contract. I see that it's sort of like a chart of some kind.
So let me tell you what it is. It
Please.
is the transformation between the geocentric conception of the universe to the heliocentric conception of the universe.
Oh,
they're burning
my
the map of the
God.
geocentric.
Wow.
Right? Is that not poignant? Is that not amazing?
It is, and you
It's
guys
the
have to see
expansion of
that.
the limit. It's literally, oh God.
No, say the extension of the limit.
And
Go ahead,
we
David.
need to transform based on new information, new mental information. We need to transform, even if it's painful. Boy, did the church kick up a lot of dust about that change. You mean the world isn't the center of the universe, it's the sun? What? But you have to eat it. Just like sometimes you have to eat the betrayal. You have to eat the fact that your partner cheated on you. You have to eat the fact that your business partner violated the contract. You can't unknow that. You can't go back to what it was before, even if you try to avoid it. So what do we have? We have a transformation.
And again,
Three of Swords.
And again, this is the threes. The threes, they are unstable. The threes, they are about being suspended in this moment of uncertainty. The Three of Wands is only better because you have the sun exalted in Aries, being like, I can embody my sense of self, and my awareness about reality is actually what is being reflected back to me by circumstance. But when you get here, it's the opposite. It's you have to make concessions, you have to make sacrifices in order to ensure that stability of the thing that you idealize. It's still an ideal. You see, the focus is still the same. It's the one ideal, it's the higher ideal. But in the sun, circumstance validates it, that it's coming to you through the changeable circumstances. You're like, okay, I see that I'm doing this thing constantly, and that I have enough stability to bring it about. With Saturn is, yes, I have enough stability to bring it about, but only if I give up things that I don't need anymore, and if I make the effort to make myself conscious about
Let
them.
go of the self. Yeah,
letting go of the self. Yes, it's the opposite movement to achieve kind of the same goal.
And I don't know if this works, but when I walked away, you're saying you sort of had to eat it, that your partner or this or that. And just that made me think of Saturn as abstinence. Saturn is not taking in food. Saturn is not taking, whereas Venus is eating like chocolates and sweets and indulgence and things like that. So that just made me think of the fact that Saturn abstains from lust, abstains from food, and Venus indulges or creates that lust or desire towards consumption in a way. And I know that we've got some moon significations there, but again, it's that night sect.
Yeah. And, just as the sun is opposite Saturn, the moon too is opposite Saturn. So there's something to think about there with what the rejection of the moon's nourishment and consumption means.
Yeah.
But what I particularly like about this science deck is that it really drove home for me this point about you can't unknow something. Like, you can turn your back to it all you want, but it's the truth and you have to accept it at some point in time. So that's the phrase I want to leave you with.
When something becomes so bright to your consciousness that you can no longer ignore it, what do you do with the ideal that you had before that didn't encompass it? Right?
What do you do?
You grieve it.
That's
There
it.
we go.
It's
Grief
Yep.
and suffering. And I know you guys, we've been on this one for a while because we just got done with the coffin, with the sarcophagus and the grieving of Virgo, but we've got that equinoctial point here with the darkening of the light, and we have to address the suffering and the grieving and the darkening of the light and the cold.
It's Saturn, it's the passage of time. You've got to acknowledge the grief after all the spring feelings that we talked about in Aries on the other side of the zodiac. New starts, spring cleaning. We're at a different point now.
And this is also a different point, but it's the realization that it's a different point in a whole different scenario. It's like we are ending things now. We are officially closed for business,
Yeah, absolutely. The crops are in. The land rests. We rest our case.
So the Picatrix has an interesting depiction of this, if I may continue with. There rises in the second phase of Libra a black man, a bridegroom having a joyous journey. This is a phase of tranquility, joy, abundance, and good living. So again, Austin refers to this factor of the black man as well being referring to Saturn and to this notion of being connected to this limit principle, this more earthly bound principle, and that bringing you stability. A bridegroom, it means kind of completion in a way, putting it very broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the bridegroom also is like about to engage, like happily, right? We're assuming a bridegroom has just, if you guys don't know what a bridegroom is, it's just a groom. It's a man who's ready to take on a wife and is at the ceremonial stage of taking that partner on. And it's like he's happily awaiting his bride and the good life ahead of him. And he's ready to take on that contractual agreement. And as Saturn is ready to do this, right? Saturn is, and when I say Saturn, I'm talking about the black man, right? When we have a figure of Saturn, they're always depicted as, in that way, is black. And so we've got this Saturnine figure who's joyously waiting at the altar to make the contract, right? It's like Saturn's ready, like for life. Like,
well, and what I love about that so much with Libra, in Libra II specifically, is we often think of the bride being the one that's decked in the ceremonial gear and like looks so beautiful on their wedding day, where now we have the bridegroom, masculine sign, Libra, being the one who is the center of attention in the Picatrix, the one who
that's because you have the exaltation piece coming in here. Saturn is more conspicuous in this particular decan. It shows its true colors in a way that elevates the character of the native that embodies that particular energy. And thus, the bridegroom represents that particular moment where the man is making vows for life that elevate his social status. Because remember, in medieval times, when the Picatrix came out, when it was hot, you had this idea that marriage would elevate your social status because you were taking on a commitment of building a family. And
Yeah.
that is some commitment, bitch. I mean,
And it
I'm
guaranteed
sorry.
your progeny. It guaranteed your success. You needed it to, in order, as a man, you had to show virility. You had to have those children in order to secure your lot in life. You needed
And
to.
remember, there was a guaranteeing of financial responsibility over the wife that was being taken in. So because, you know, there was given that the wife was going to be sustained by the husband at those times in
And sometimes a
most
dowry was
cultures.
in place as well. So the groom would get not only the wife as property, but some of the wife's father's
Livestock.
luxuries. Yeah. So
And
they were taking on a certain status in order to take that woman. They were also taking her with a payment, essentially. But
I mean, that
Yes.
still happens. That's
Yeah,
still
yeah,
that's still a
completely.
practice in some parts
Yeah.
of the world.
Yeah, totally. So, but if you're thinking, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about exactly that, KD. When you think about the woman in white, white is a Venus color. The bride is Venus. The beautiful, you know, young woman is Venus, right? The idea of, like, you know, your typical bride being young and gorgeous and clad in white and pure and all those things, that's all Venus, right? But here you're exalting the bridegroom. We're talking about him. And a lot of times, even like traditionally, the man is wearing like a tuxedo, which is black, right? And the woman is, or it doesn't have to be, right? You can wear anything to a wedding at this point, but it's like you've got this formal sort of like clad in black figure that, you know, traditionally he proposes or he connects with the father in order to make a contract to take on the wife or something like this. And he's happily doing so. And he's like, Saturn wants to, you know, commit for life. He's getting benefit.
Yes. Everyone likes Venus.
Yeah, I mean,
And in a
who
more,
wouldn't?
I suppose in a more spiritual sense, having that commitment to something, to some aspect of the multiplicity, you know, having that commitment to things that are beautiful for you, for instance, having which means being true to yourself, being true to things that ring true to your soul, you know, that are like resonant to who you are. That's the way of showing who you are throughout, you know, time. When you have that, then you have a good expression of that combination of Saturn and Venus.
And yeah, and it's life-giving. I mean, if Saturn's the reaper in death and it's coming at the dark side, Saturn's like, yay, I get someone to be with me when I'm old and dying. I get someone to be with me when it's cold. I get someone to be with me when I don't have. And I get that warmth and that love and that nurturing when I don't have. I get something to fall back on when I don't have.
To make myself aware of the things that I'm not particularly conscious of within my own boundaries, right?
And not
Someone
only,
to help me be aware of my boundaries. even.
right, but when you talk about the children, it's like, and Saturn is like agriculture, so it's like Saturn gets, now once Saturn gets a wife, once Saturn gets Venus or whatever, Saturn gets a whole work fleet for the fields as well, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, the bridegroom is happy here to take on that that commitment, I think. And Venus as well. Venus is the wife, she's the love, she's the lover. And so it's a really beautiful thing. We don't want to make it out. I know we've got that.
It's about
heartbreak
fertility
card.
as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Fertility of the land, right? Which Saturn loves. So they make a good combo. I think the heartbreak comes at the betrayal point, which you're taking that risk every single time that you're making a big commitment. You're taking the risk that it could not work out, that it could lead to betrayal, and you can't possibly know. Let's say even if you're vetted, right? You're totally like sure or whatever. There's things that you can't see, which is a Saturnine thing, right? And there's unforetold futures, and we're taking that risk when we love and when we bind ourselves. Yeah.
And so there are some interesting people
Yeah, let's get to
born
the nativities, shall we?
in this particular decan.
In looking up folks who have their sun within these degrees of this Decan, I was super shocked to find actually not that many people, not as many as I thought, many historical figures and celebrities to choose from. And the ones that I did find were all very serious figures. They tend to have a very serious bent, a very Saturnine bent, I would say, to their art or their work that they put out in the world. Did you have any you wanted to talk about specifically, David?
Well, Giuseppe Verdi is the one that that composed my favorite Dies Irae version. Like, there's a lot of authors that have, pieces composed that are called Dies Irae, which is about Judgment Day. And so that's very Saturnine, obviously, and very Saturn in Libra kind of thing.
Because it's a
Judgment
beautiful
Day.
piece. It's music. It's a beautiful piece of music.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Intense.
Very intense.
It's probably the most recognizable of that hymn.
I'll link it below in the description of this video. I'll find it on YouTube and link it below. And then, I mean, I'm excited about two in particular. I don't have all that much to say. They kind of speak for themselves. But we've got Aleister Crowley, or Crowley, and we've also got John Lennon, which I feel like their lives kind of embody some of this dichotomy as well.
Yeah, that
Well,
Venus.
John Lennon with Imagine, not only with Imagine, but with the whole Beatles advent, but with his song that is iconic, Imagine in particular, he is proposing a world with things that we don't imagine in the current narrative. He's like, imagine if we expanded our awareness about what we could build,
and she's talking about suffering in a sense.
And he's got Mars in Libra. I think he's got an Aries rising with Mars in Libra. I'm not sure, but I'm sure he's got Mars in Libra.
That's correct. That's correct.
And he's like, imagine there being no suffering, right? We've got the Lord of Sorrow, right? Imagine there's a place of harmony, right? Imagine there's a place with no sorrow. Imagine there's a place with peace, even in your heart, which is a very Venusian thing, but taking it into your mind. Imagination happens in the mind, right? But that imagining quality that you can imagine this place of peace or whatever it is has an experiential quality on your heart, right? That song invokes emotion, because when you start to imagine things, you can start to feel that there might be that possibility or something like this. So I think that's really, kind of profound.
He's a great example of nativity for this Decan. A few others I wanted to mention are Gore Vidal, who was a famous author who passed away not that long ago, but had some very famous fictional books and plays. He was also a playwright about American historical and political figures. So again, very serious, but in art, like a very governance and justice framed, art is what he was known for. Luciano Pavarotti, another musician or musical figure who, while very Venusian in especially how people remember him in the past, is actually right now facing a lot of accusations of sexual assault, which I think has to do with some Saturnine deception. In terms, you can't unknow that this beautiful tenor, one of the best tenor opera singers in the world in the past few centuries, is actually a super sketch guy.
He was the most acclaimed at his peak.
Yeah. I mean, I for some reason have vinyl records of his operas. I don't know why. Anyway, we also have Charlton Heston, disgusting gun rights advocate. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a Venusian figure, but the way that she both presented herself as quite Saturnine, but also the sorts of things that she were interested in was ones of legacy, things of long-lasting, enduring social effect on the US. She was the president's wife during very trying times, such as the end of the Depression and the beginning of World War II. And then Paul Simon, another musician who I would say has a little bit of that same vibe of kind of thinking of artistic, maybe not an ideal world, but an artistic depiction of the world, and just kind of exploring that in more of a thought experiment than manifesting it realistically.
Yeah, and if you think about, I'm sorry to go back to John Lennon, but I was just kind of like contemplating, like his relationship with Yoko Ono was very controversial, and she was like this Saturnine type of woman, just in general. And the fact that
she was an Aquarius, wasn't she?
Yeah, and the fact that she did that they did the bed in is like, a protest, right? So protest being Saturn. It could be Mars as well, but like protest being Saturn, but in the bed where Venus likes to be, or whatever, that just really kind of came across my mind, and I wanted to say it before we stopped.
Absolutely. I love it.
Okay, cool, guys. This was really fun, and fun. Everybody else is like, no, it's depressing.
It's terrible. Why are you laughing?
I'm like, this is fun. The Lord of Sorrow. Everyone okay? But I do really appreciate you all tuning in again. And we have a new Patreon subscriber. Hello and thank you. We've got a couple new YouTube subscribers. So I just wanted to remind you all that we do have a study group happening. You can find us over on Patreon for that, as well as all of our contact information is in the About section. So if you don't catch it on these videos, you can check it out over there on the About section of this page.
And please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. We really appreciate that.
We do.
Please.
We do, and we will appreciate that.
Drop an emoji in the comments. Doesn't cost you anything. Yeah.
Absolutely. Imagine if people, yeah.
Imagine if the people
would
paid
just
for
like and
posts and
subscribe.
I love it.
All right, y'all. KD, where can people find you?
kddayton.com. You can also find me on Twitter at the same handle, Instagram, KD_Dayton.
Awesome. And David Fisher, where can people find you?
In the first place, astrology.com, and also Instagram in the first place astrology, first place astro at Twitter. You can also find me on Facebook under the same name. And I also offer tutoring sessions, general readings with astrology, a lot of services that are available on my website, and tarot readings.
Okay, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. And KD, would you like to ring us out with a poem?
Sure. So this is the poem that's the end of the 36 Secrets chapter on this Deccan. It's called Now Let No Charitable Hope by Eleanor Wiley. Now let no charitable hope confuse my mind with images of eagle and antelope. I am by nature none of these. I was, being human, born alone. I am, being woman, hard beset. I live by squeezing from a stone what little nourishment I can get. In masks outrageous and austere, the years go by in single file, but none has merited my fear, and none has quite escaped my smile.
Ia mata o kaka bersama yo kena soba da soba kena mata iba nakau di mawa kena soba and soba ate iba nake au chuno ba ikana kamaya ta onga Koyo Koyo Masena Mataibe kana sabaso Inakina Tabaine Toyokas Imba yatona Watabaike